Let's get started. Okay, Eric, 30 seconds, we'll get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Anyone not hear me? I think we have to adjust the gain. Can you adjust the gain on the mic, please? Test one. Oh, there we go. Okay, please just be seated. All right, terrific. Okay, Chris. All right. Welcome everyone to the June meeting of the Ottawa Centre of the RASC. Thanks for coming. We've got a fine program for you tonight. Let's go to the next slide, please, Chris. Okay, after a brief introduction of myself, Gary Boyle will do his usual segment. That's on the Ottawa skies, what to expect in the month of June and in the night sky. We have a special guest speaker today, Dan Falk. You may remember Dan Falk from a couple of years ago. He came and he talked about his previous book, In Search of Time. He's going to be talking about references in Shakespeare's work to the cosmos. So I've seen his presentation. You're in for a treat. We've got a bunch of announcements. So we've pulled the announcements that are normally at the end of the meeting. We brought them up to just before the break, okay? Because we want to make sure that we're not rushing those this time. Right after the break, we're going to do the observations. Again, a bit out of sequence here. I kind of like to move things around because I get a bit bored and a bit impatient. It doesn't matter. I can't see any of you with those lights. Okay. Is that better? Okay. All right. So after the observation, the members' observations, Tim Cole is going to be sharing some work, a fine presentation on the astrolabe, which is a predecessor to the sextant, and then other things as he'll explain. And then finally, door prizes. We've got a bunch of, for those who haven't been here before, we've got a bunch of door prizes. Pick up tickets at the front. Sylvie will be helping me. Thank you, Sylvie, giving out the tickets. So we'll do that. Next slide, please. We've got a bunch of new members again. Really encouraging to see. So far this year, we've got 32 new members. Is Mark, Mary, Edgar, Michelle, Constantin here tonight? If you are, say hi. All right, welcome. Okay, we'd love to talk to you, find out what drew you to the RASC. I'll talk a little bit later on about are on Carling Drive. There's some concern that was raised quite well, actually, in this article. Rob Dick was quoted, the concern being that the LED lighting, street lighting, has blue light in it, which reflects and bounces around a lot. Very interesting. If you go on the web, just Google it and read this segment, you can see that some of the people who are living along the Carling are basically saying it's too bright. They're having difficulty sleeping at night. They can't close their blinds, enough to keep the lights out. And of course, as Rob points out in this article here, you can't see the stars at all. So Rob talks about some alternatives here. So it's well worth Googling that article if you didn't see it and going through it. Nice job, Rob, by the way.
Carling is 3 times brighter now than it was last year.
3 times brighter. Wow, on Carling. On from any of our members is these kind of segments that are appearing more and more in the news, and I'm sure you're seeing it on not just in print media, but and it's coming up more and more about aircraft, helicopters. Reach with laser pointers, and I'm feeling more and more uncomfortable doing that because of these kinds of things. Next. Something I wanted to share with you. Gary Boyle does a heck of a lot of outreach on the radio. A ton of people interview him. I mean, I've talked before in previous months about his national segment on the RASC, where he talks about the Night Sky segment that he's doing. That you'll hear in a moment. Gary does that also nationally in the rasc.ca website. But recently with the camelopardalids, there was lots of interest in that potentially it could have been a big, huge meteor, shower, storm, whatever. Well, as you know, it wasn't quite that at all. But Gary Boyle was interviewed by quite a few people. Well done, Gary. That's really nice. You really have a tremendous outreach role there. I think that's it for me. I want to do very little talk tonight and get right to the speakers. Gary, up to you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone to June Ottawa Skies. Hello, everybody on the internet. Just a couple of things, quick things. I know we have a very packed night. There is a supernova. Next to this. Now, it was around 15th magnitude when it was spotted in March. It's kind of lost to about 13.5. So all the astrophotographers outshining the entire galaxy. It's just really mixed up in the hub over here. Okay, next slide. Well, M106 is right here, and like I said, Ken has been a TC and really pretty well using the Big Dipper to find the galaxy. It's about 23 million light years away. It's about 9th magnitude, 8.5 to 9th magnitude, the galaxy itself, but overall you might not. Excellent. How many saw 10? How many saw 9? 8? 7? Yeah, I only saw 3 too. Paul Cloninger and Eric LeMay traveled to North Bay and Sudbury for nothing. Thanks for adding to the economy and the Gaster guys, really appreciate it. So we do have another meteor shower. This is an annual meteor shower, the South Boötids, as opposed to the camelopardalids, which was a surprise. The comet got too close to Jupiter, and you know the whole story from last month. So we didn't have any history. Even when I got in the air, I said it could be a dud or it could be so I protected myself and I said it could be a dud, and it was. But at least I got people outside to look at the nighttime sky, which is a good thing too. So here are the Boötids. I like the rate 0. So it's, again, it's a slow shower. So June 27th is a weeknight too. I think it's a Tuesday night. So go out and try it, but don't expect much. Okay, next slide, please. There's a comet in the sky which is getting almost naked eye. By next month it'll be naked eye, Comet Jauch. And it's just over here, pretty well off the twins, the Gemini twins. Here we have Jupiter and Mercury. So you will catch it at night. Pretty low in the sky, but it's getting brighter. It's about 8.5 now, but they think it might come to 6 or even 5th. So let's hope it will be. Next slide. And just your favorite strawberry moon this month, and pick your favorite phase. And that's going to be it for this month, I think. That's it, folks. See you next month, and on to our guest speaker. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker, Dan Falk, is a familiar face. He was here a couple of years ago when he talked about his book, as I mentioned earlier, In Search of Time. He's a science journalist, author, broadcaster. His writing and credits include submissions, articles in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Walrus, Sky News, and so forth. He's been on the CBC radio programs Quirks and Quarks, one of my favorite programs, and Ideas. He's won gold and silver medals for radio programming from the New York festivals, and the Science Writing Award in Physics and Astronomy from the American Institute of Physics, which he won twice. His first book, Universe on a T-shirt, The Quest for a Theory of Everything, was well received. His most recent book, In Search of Time, The Journeys Along a Curious Dimension, was published in 2008. And he recently completed a prestigious Knight Journalism Fellowship at MIT. Pleased to welcome Dan Falk.
Oh, thanks for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out. Can you hear me at the back okay? All right. I can't see you at the back, so I don't know if you're putting up your hands or not, but I'm going to assume that you can hear me at the back. Okay. And bear with me for just a second because I've sort of got multiple computers going. I just want to be able to see my next slide on my computer as well as the current slide on the RASC computer. It's all going to work out just fine, but just bear with me for about 10 seconds while I... Yeah, there we go. All right, so Shakespeare and science. This is a little different. Perhaps some of you were at my previous talk, or maybe if you're really lucky, you were at both of my previous talks here. But this time it's a little bit of a departure because this time there's an element of the arts and literature, and it's a bit of a departure from pure sort of physics and astronomy. So what is there to connect Shakespeare and science? Oops, where's the clicker? This is it right here, right? Okay. It doesn't matter where I aim it? Doesn't matter where I aim it? Okay. All right, so Shakespeare, wasn't a scientist, and there's perhaps no immediate connecting thread between these two realms in the title of my book. But when we think about the time that Shakespeare lived, one second here, it was a very different world. There were a lot of things that seem to us today to be very non-scientific. Witchcraft, astrology, magic of various kinds. So, we think of modern science. I mean, modern science was not yet a thing. It simply didn't exist in Shakespeare's time. But having said that, when we look at sort of this period of history with the advantage of hindsight, there were a lot of discoveries that, looking back, do seem like very important sort of landmark events in sort of the birth of modern science. And I won't talk through all the different ones on the chart, only to say that it's a period that kind of begins with Copernicus's book, the De Revolutionibus. This is his book of the heliocentric theory, putting the sun at the center of the solar system. And then towards the end of this period, we have Galileo aiming his telescope at the night sky and publishing a little book reporting his findings and finally giving kind of like solid support to the Copernican theory, which had really seemed very hypothetical and maybe a bit pie in the sky up until that point. And in between, we've got some other various advances. But here's Shakespeare's lifetime, and he's there. Now, whether he was interested in any of this, of course, is what we're going to talk about and is open for debate, but he was there. He at least had a sort of a ringside seat for these discoveries because he lives while these things are going on. In fact, Copernicus's book is published a solid 2 decades before Shakespeare is born, and he sort of reaches retirement just around the time of Galileo's book, and I'll have more to say about that. So again, there were some traditional ways of seeing things like the geocentric picture. This goes back to the ancient Greeks and probably beyond. It was probably the first way that we imagined the cosmos when we got around to being able to conceive of the cosmos. I mean, the Earth, there it is under our feet. Surely it's got to be at the center of everything. And if we take a close-up view of the Greek view, we find the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water at the center, and then surrounding that we have the crystalline spheres that were imagined to hold up the planets, and then the outermost sphere holding up the so-called fixed stars. But there was again a newer, more modern picture, and that's Copernicus's view, and on the right-hand side you see the sort of the simplified diagram. This is a diagram from Copernicus's book, putting the sun at the center. Now, actually, his theory was very mathematical and was probably mostly read by mathematicians and a handful of astronomers. So conceptually, we think of it as this great shake-up of events. But again, it was kind of a technical work at the time, and one of the things I talk about in the book is, well, how far-reaching was its impact? I mean, Did ordinary people care? Was it just specialists? Now, there was, in terms of artists and writers, some people were kind of affected more than others. John Milton. Now, Milton lives a half century after Shakespeare. He has a very strong reaction to it. He goes on at length as kind of a debate in Paradise Lost as to which of the two ways of envisioning the cosmos is more appropriate. And as a matter of fact, he doesn't really seem to support Copernicus, but he certainly knows a lot about Copernicus because he definitely talks about it. The poet John Donne is closer to being a contemporary of Shakespeare, and I'm just going to read from one of his poems called An Anatomy of the World, 1611. Now, this is sort of in response to Galileo, right? So this is the tail end of the time chart that we were just looking at. So he's had a chance to kind of respond to Galileo's findings, which again seem to support the Copernican theory, and he's a bit taken aback by the whole affair. He says, "So did the world from the first hour decay, that evening was beginning of the day, and new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it." So he's, it's a very strong reaction, kind of a negative reaction to these new findings, which he labels the new philosophy. So it's a term that we hear with regard to not just Copernicus, but other changes that were happening at that time. 1543 was a good year because it wasn't just Copernicus's book, it was also Vesalius's book on human anatomy. So it was kind of this landmark year, again, with the advantage of hindsight. So when we look through Shakespeare's writings, we don't immediately see this kind of direct engagement with the new philosophy. He just doesn't, he's not that kind of a writer. He doesn't tackle it head on. But having said that, when we look at his works and comb through them, we see many references to the stars, the heavens, heavenly spheres. It's a phrase that crops up quite a bit. The sun, the moon, which always seem to be doing something, rising or setting. Eclipses come up in several places, famously near the beginning of King Lear, but a couple of other places too. Meteors and comets, although not necessarily meaning the exact same meaning that we ascribe to them today, but they are definitely mentioned. Now, the next thing is a video clip, and it'll play automatically, so I think we're all set. All right, so it'll be fine. So all you need to know for this first video clip is it's going to be from Julius Caesar, and the subject is, well, some of the citizens of Rome are petitioning Caesar. Caesar had banished the brother of one of these guys, and he's upset, and they're all actually a bit upset, so they're trying to get him unbanished. So let's see if we can take a look at the first video clip. It should play automatically. Oops, I have to push this button.
Is there no voice more worthy than my own, to sound more sweetly in great Caesar's ear for the repealing of my banished brother?
I kiss thy hand, but not in flattery, Caesar, desiring thee that Publius Cimber may have an immediate freedom of repeal.
What, Brutus?
Pardon, Caesar, Caesar, pardon. As low as to thy foot doth Cassius fall to beg enfranchisement for Publius Cimber.
I could be well moved if I were as you. If I could pray to move, then prayers would move me. But I am constant as the northern star, of whose true fixed and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament. The skies are painted with unnumbered sparks, they are all fire, and every one doth shine, but there's but one in all doth hold his place.
Okay, so there's kind of, there's a little bit of an astronomy lesson in there. It's interesting in a number of ways. So one thing is, and perhaps a bit disappointingly, but it doesn't commit you to either the earth-centered or the sun-centered view. Well, what Shakespeare is taking advantage of, that of course you guys are amateur astronomers, so you know that the Earth spins. I don't know if you can see it, but hopefully you can see it. But if you can't, I'm just spinning a styrofoam Earth on its axis. So the Earth spins like this. And this orientation, it's like a gyroscope. The Earth's axis just points in whatever direction it points, and as it moves, well, we know now that it's moving around the sun, but the direction that the axis is pointing doesn't change. Or if you were a geocentrist, you could just say it's here and the universe is moving around it. But at any rate, it points to a direction where there just happens to be a medium bright star, and that's Polaris, the North Star. For those of you who know about precession of the equinoxes, just try not to worry about it. It doesn't affect our current discussion very, very much. So, whoops, let me find the clicker here. So this is the fact that obviously Shakespeare is taking advantage of, and so if you were to aim a camera at the North Star, as many of you have done, and just sort of keep the shutter open, you get something like this, and just taking advantage of this fact that the star that happens to be near the center of the in line with the Earth's axis isn't going to move, and all the other stars are going to be moving around it, and that's the metaphor that Shakespeare has put into Caesar's mouth. So that sort of works, and again, it doesn't involve a commitment to the geocentric or heliocentric view. I should add also, though, but this clearly is something that the audience would have got, right? I mean, Shakespeare wouldn't have put it there if the audience was going to be baffled by it. So I think he expected some measure of relatively straightforward engagement of the audience in the theater. And remember, in Shakespeare's time, there was no light pollution or very little. So now, of course, there were clouds because it's England, right? But when there was a clear day, I think what you saw in the sky was actually pretty important. I bet people talked about it. If there was an eclipse, if there was a comet, I think it was a big deal. I mean, yeah, today there would still, we'd forward things on the internet, but I think back then, no internet, no social media, no video games, I think people were probably quite engaged with the sky. All right, I'm going to go to an example, perhaps a little bit more concrete, something we can really sink our teeth into from Hamlet, and the famous opening scene, which you'll remember, or just briefly for those who haven't seen the play in a while, of course, there's a ghostly figure that has been appearing on the ramparts at Elsinore, and by golly, he looks a lot like the dead king. Turns out, we find out later that the king was murdered, and it gets kind of involved. But when does the king appear? So this comes up in the conversation. Bernardo is chatting with Horatio, who has just arrived on the scene. And he says, "Last night of all, when yon same star that's westward from the pole had made his course to Ulm, that part of heaven where now it burns, Marcellus and myself, the bell then beating one," and he doesn't get to finish the sentence because just then the ghost appears and they have to deal with that. But this is a very interesting scene, and scholars have been trying to figure out what is this yond same star that's westward from the pole. So what do we know about this? We're given. So what do you know? What do you have to know to find out what's up in the sky at a particular time? You have to know basically two things, and you probably all of you have a planisphere at home, or yeah, you should have a planisphere at home, right? So they cost about $10 or so. So you line up the time of night with the time of year. Those are the only two variables. And once you've lined up those two things with each other, this circle shows you everything that's up in the sky, right? And today you can also do it with astronomical software. What time was it? That's actually given, right? We know it's 1 a.m. because the text says that. The time of year is a bit trickier, and because I don't have a lot of time to tell you about it, I'm just going to tell you that it was probably November, but we can chat later about why we know it's November, but we think it was November. So there were some guesses that different scholars have made, and depending on which edition of the plays you're reading, if it's the really thin one, the whole thing just goes unmentioned. If it's a really thick one, there will be some discussion of what star it is, and if you get the middle one, there'll be a little footnote next to star westward from the pole, and it'll say, there'll be an asterisk next to pole, and it'll say in the footnote, pole star, because you couldn't have figured out on your own that pole meant pole star, right? So, that's very helpful. So go for the thickest one you can get with the most footnotes. So you'll find editions where they say, well, probably it was a planet, or maybe it was the star Capella. So for various reasons, there's some issues there. So here's a diagram of the sky, and now let's see if I got here's our pointer. All right, so you've got 1 a.m. In November, and it actually doesn't really matter whether you're doing England or Denmark. They're pretty close in terms of latitude, so that's not a big deal. So what's going on? All right, I better stay here near the microphone. So there's Polaris, so the pole. All right, and that's the north point on the horizon. No problem so far. So westward from the pole, well, here's west. So what's westward from the pole? Presumably it means somewhere around here, but you might ask, well, why not all the way over here? Well, if it was all the way over here, you wouldn't say westward from the pole. You would just say west. And, you always sort of compare things to what's nearby. If someone asks you, where's the Canada Museum of Science and Technology, you're not going to say, well, it's east of Calgary. I mean, it's true that it's east of Calgary, but it's just not the way you would choose to describe it. So we're left somewhere in this ballpark. Now, so a couple of guesses, right? Capella. Here's the star Capella. Well, is that westward from the pole? I don't think so. I mean, I think that's almost overhead. So this is the horizon. The overhead point would be the geometric center, I don't know, somewhere in Auriga, right? So Capella is nearly overhead. And even if we're off, like, we said 1 a.m. November, even if we're off by 2 weeks in the time of year or half an hour in the time of day, I mean, that would move Capella a little bit, but it's not going to put Capella down here, not really. Now, the other guess was a planet. Well, a planet has to be on the ecliptic, right? Here's the ecliptic. It's the dotted line. And that doesn't really work because we're trying to get over here. I mean, you could be over here, but that's just, it doesn't seem to work out. So those guesses don't work very well. By the way, this isn't my own, I have the luxury of being a journalist, so I find articles written by other people that have investigated this. In this case, it's Donald Olson at Texas. So what is this object? Well, right, we want, we lost our map. We want something around Cassiopeia. And by the way, why can't it be Cassiopeia? Oops. Oh, you did that. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Why can't it be Cassiopeia? Well, I mean, it could, except that Cassiopeia doesn't have one single bright star. It has 5 stars that are all approximately the same brightness. So it would just be a weird thing to say, yond same star that's westward from the pole, and point to a grouping of 5 stars. It's just a bit peculiar. You could say Cassiopeia, or you could say the W or something. But it was, okay, you can go to where we were. Okay, thanks. So there isn't a bright candidate star in Cassiopeia, but there used to be one, and I know some of the history of science buffs are one step ahead of me. But there was a bright star in Cassiopeia, and that was what we now call a supernova. It was the new star of 1572. It's actually indicated here in Tycho's drawing. It's up here. It's labeled Nova Stella in the little index, and there it is. These are the 5 stars. That's the W. There's a couple of extra ones, but that's the W of Cassiopeia. This is the supernova. They didn't know it was a supernova at the time. Tycho Brahe in Denmark observed it. Thomas Digges in England observed it. Basically, anyone who was looking up at the sky and was interested, took notes and was quite excited about this thing. This is the reference for this. Donald Olson wrote about it in Sky and Telescope a little while back. I'm going to say a bit more about Tycho Brahe later because he turns out to be an important figure in this story. Now, if you're doing the math on the date for this, you might think, well, Shakespeare was only a little kid, right? He was 8 years old when the supernova appeared. Was he really going to give a darn? He was only 8 years old. Well, he was already in grammar school. That's one thing. But it wasn't just like it appeared and then it was gone a few days later. This thing was very bright and stuck around for about a year, gradually getting dimmer. So people were talking about it, I think probably for a long time. And then Holinshed, when he writes his history book a decade or two later, also is talking about how big a deal this thing was. And Shakespeare is an adult by the time this book goes into its 2nd edition. And we know Shakespeare read Holinshed because he's always cribbing from it. So Shakespeare could have seen it as a kid and then could have been reminded about it as an adult reading Holinshed's Chronicles. I'm going to talk just a bit about some of these other figures that are relevant here. I've already mentioned Copernicus. This is 20 years beforehand. Copernicus publishes his heliocentric theory and then dies, which is terrific because he doesn't have to deal with any of the fallout from it. Galileo comes at the end of our time period, making telescopic observations of the night sky. Tycho Brahe, as I mentioned, is the supernova guy, and we'll say a little bit more about him later. Another key figure is the most important English scientist of the time, Thomas Digges. And yeah, I know, he didn't have time to pose for a selfie like the others did, so we don't know what he looked like. So these are some of the figures that are important in sort of the astronomy and structure of the cosmos-scene. Sticking with Tycho Brahe, the supernova guy, his writings about the supernova established his reputation. The king was very impressed, the king of Denmark, and said, look, I'm going to give you an island. This is a pretty good deal if you can get it. The king gave him his own island called Wien in the channel that separates Denmark and Sweden, and says, and here's a bunch of money, build an observatory like you said you wanted to do, and bring glory to the nation. That's still how science works today, right? Lots of money if you want to do some research, right? Okay. So he does go ahead and builds this grand observatory, and it's an interesting setting. In this old map, contemporary to the time, you see just right of center there, you see Tycho Brahe's island, and then beside it, we can zoom in a little bit. Beside it, there's a sea battle going on, so that's cool. But there's a castle just in the lower left, and this is not just any old castle. It's the castle adjacent to the town of I don't, if I'm pronouncing it right, Helsinor in Danish, something like that, but in English, Elsinore. So it's not just some random castle. This is the castle that Shakespeare chooses as the setting for the play Hamlet. Hamlet is an older play. There had been versions of it going back probably for centuries. There was a French version that was his most direct source. But they just said Denmark, right? It was Shakespeare's original contribution to the play to set it at Elsinore, a castle that just happens to be within line of sight of the eccentric astronomer's castle. Shakespeare, as far as we know, never left England, but some of his acting colleagues did. People from his acting company performed at court in Elsinore. So you can sort of imagine that when they came back, they would have had stories to tell. So I like to think that Shakespeare at least had to know that that island with the astronomer existed. And by the way, King James actually visited Tycho Brahe face to face. He wasn't yet King of England at that time, he was just the King of Scotland, but that's kind of cool too. So Tycho Brahe was, I guess, an eccentric nobleman astronomer, but also like kind of famous, and I think people wanted to meet him. So we're not quite finished with Hamlet yet. We can look at, for example, the cast of characters in Hamlet, and most of them have sort of classical, vaguely Latin-sounding names, except for the two courtiers, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who really have extraordinarily Danish-sounding names, right? They have sort of hyper-Danish names. So what is the deal with that, and what was Shakespeare's source, or where did he pull them, or did he just invent them out of whole cloth? Well, the thing is, let's go back to our friend, the astronomer Tycho Brahe. Tycho was had compiled all these observations, and he was keen on sending them because he wanted to show off. So he was sending them to other astronomers and scientifically minded thinkers around Europe. And he actually had his own publishing printing press on the island because, again, the king gave him so much money that he could do that. And he got this professional engraving done. It's a copperplate engraving, which he would use as the frontispiece for these observations when he was sending them out. By the way, he did send them to a guy in England and said, can you forward them to Thomas Digges, the guy without the selfie that I showed earlier, and we'll talk more about him. He even said, by the way, if you'd like, it would be great if one of your English poets wanted to write a few lines of verse in honor of me. He said he'd be cool with that. He doesn't mention Shakespeare, but yeah, no, right. I think he was that kind of guy. All right, so in this fanciful engraving, you've got, obviously that's Tycho Brahe in the middle, and then you've got the crests of various family members from his extended, he was a nobleman, so all his relatives were important noble people, and sure enough, there's Rosencrantz and there's Guildenstern. I know a couple of you saw it coming, but yeah, there they are. And is it a coincidence or is it not a coincidence? And we can talk about that. But it's quite plausible, I think, that Shakespeare either saw this engraving or was talking to people who had recently been to, I think there's some kind of a connection there more than can just be sort of dismissed as complete coincidence. All right, so I've talked about everything. Well, Galileo I'll get to in a minute. I do want to say a bit more about Thomas Digges. Thomas Digges published a updated version of an almanac that had first been printed by his father, who was an astronomer. Digges adds a whole new chapter, sort of pumping up the Copernican system. So this is actually the first popularization of the Copernican system printed in England, in English for an English-speaking audience. And he goes further than Copernicus because he includes this diagram, which is actually quite large. It folds out when you buy the book. It's a diagram that so it's the standard Copernican view with the sun at the middle, and here's the Earth over here. But he has these stars now, not just on a single sphere, but extending outward, as far as we can tell, without any bounds, so possibly even infinite. So do we see anything like that in Shakespeare's works? Maybe, and maybe we don't have to look any further than Hamlet. In Act 2, Scene 2, I mean, this is a bit speculative, but, it's 400 years ago. We're allowed to speculate a little bit. Is Denmark a really horrible place? Actually, the correct answer is no, Denmark's really nice. But the topic for discussion is how horrible is it? Hamlet says, the question is, is it a prison? Hamlet says, why then, 'tis unto you, for there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. To me it is a prison. Rosencrantz says, why then your ambition makes it one, 'tis too narrow for your mind. And Hamlet comes back with, oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. So you have this unusual line, king of infinite space, and it's not something that Shakespeare uses very often, and it doesn't even crop up in other Tudor era drama. It's just not a very common expression. And even when Shakespeare does say infinite, he's usually not talking about spatial extent, but here he is. So it's quite an odd thing. And is it a reference to the infinitely extendeth universe of Thomas Digges, his countrymen? Possibly. All right, I know we're a bit short on time. There are more connections between the family of Thomas Digges and Shakespeare. They were sort of neighbors. I'm going to have to just gloss over that because I have to move along. But it is quite interesting. These are not just two random people living in London. The son of Thomas Digges actually becomes a poet and writes a little verse in praise of Shakespeare that gets published in the first folio in 1623. So it's quite interesting. There's some connections between Shakespeare and the family of Thomas Digges. So that gets us on towards, I think Galileo is the next thing. So Galileo, again, comes at the end of this interval. And remember, he only gets his hands on a telescope in 1609. He doesn't invent it. It's a Dutch invention, but he quickly improves it. He's the first one, or among the first few, because there actually is an Englishman, Thomas Harriot, doing the same thing. It's quite interesting. Harriot, for whatever reason, chooses not to publish. But Galileo points his telescope at the night sky in the fall of 1609, and by the following spring, he's published a little book called Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, and he's discovered that there are irregular features on the surface of the moon. There's also kind of a Death Star thing going on, which there's a whole literature on why is that crater so big and what's going on, but I don't have to skip over that for now. But he finds these irregularities on the surface of the moon. He finds, these are his original drawings, were actually perhaps more lifelike and vivid. He finds 4 objects that no one had seen before seeming to revolve around Jupiter, and now we call them the Galilean moons of Jupiter. But at first he was wondering, what are these stars and what are they doing? But he eventually clued in, there's 4 of them, and they must revolve around Jupiter, because even as Jupiter moves across the sky, they stay with it. And he also aimed his telescope at the Milky Way and was able to resolve that this wasn't just a cloudy band. There are actually thousands of stars too faint to see with the eye, which you could see through the telescope. So all of this is kind of shocking, and later he would go on to see Venus going through phases. It all sort of lends support to the Copernican system. So again, this comes kind of late in the game, so you could say, well, Shakespeare couldn't possibly have had time to soak that in, because he writes his last play around 1612, 1613. It's just too late in the game. But people have pointed to, so I don't think that's correct, and a few small number of scholars have pointed to the play Cymbeline and said that the dramatic fifth act, I don't know whether to leave the whole thing as a teaser. I can't talk you through it because it's a little bit involved, and also I'd have to explain the plot of Cymbeline, which by itself takes about a minute, even if you talk quickly. But there is a dramatic scene near the end of Cymbeline where Jupiter, the god, comes down from the sky, and this is not something that happens a lot, or actually at all, except for this one scene in the Shakespeare canon, and then 4 ghosts move around our hero as he lies sleeping on the stage. So there's something that kind of looks like it might be alluding to Galileo's discoveries, and that's pretty interesting. And I thought, when I first heard about this, I thought, well, there must be dozens of articles on this. This must be the most exciting thing that Shakespeare scholars could possibly write about. But no, there's actually only about 3 people who have written articles about this. But I think it's pretty cool. So to finish off, I want to just talk about sort of the worldview in general, never mind sort of heliocentric, geocentric, but how did people in Shakespeare's time envision the world? And this is something that, of course, the characters in King Lear confront. It's a very dark play, right? So bad things happen, and bad things even happen to good people. And when that happens, of course, you want to know who to blame, because you're not going to blame yourself. You always do the right thing and make the right choice. So it has to be somebody's fault that all these things are happening. And one option that you've got is to blame the heavens. Blame the stars, blame the universe. And again, in this period, there was imagined to be this very intimate connection between what was happening up there in the celestial realm and what was happening here, families, political affairs. So terrestrial stuff, celestial stuff, imagined to be intimately linked in some way. So is the next one the video? Yep. The next one's the video. Okay, so I'm going to show a clip from King Lear. All you have to know is that it's pretty early in the play. There are two characters. Gloucester, who is one of the nobles, he's sort of an ally of King Lear, it doesn't really matter, and his illegitimate son, Edmund, who will end up sort of being a villain. And the subject for discussion is these late eclipses of the sun and moon. So that's what they're talking about. The thing to look out for is that Gloucester and Edmund interpret the eclipses very differently. And it's a slightly longer clip than the Julius Caesar clip because towards the end, Edmund turns evil. And that's kind of fun to watch. It's fun to watch someone have their Darth Vader moment like that. So let's have a look at that.
These late eclipses in the sun and moon portend no good to us. Though the wisdom of nature can reason it thus and thus, yet nature finds itself scourged by the secret effects. Love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide. In cities, mutinies, in countries, discord, in palaces, treason. And the bond cracked twixt son and father.
Now, I've trimmed it a bit just because Gloucester goes on and on. He's very upset. He's blaming everything on the universe, so I've just condensed it a bit.
Tis strange.
This is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeits of our own behaviour, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and stars, as if we were villains on necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and treachers by spherical predominance, drunkards, liars, and adulterers by an enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by a divine thrusting on. An admirable evasion of whoremaster man to lay his goatish disposition on the charge of a star. My father compounded with my mother under the dragon's tail, and my nativity was under Ursa Major, so that it follows I am rough and lecherous. I should have been that I am, had the maidenliest star in the firmament twinkled on my bastardizing. Edgar. Patty comes like the catastrophe of the old comedy. My cue is villainous melancholy with a sigh like Tom of Bedlam. Oh, these eclipses do portend these divisions.
So there's some good stuff in there. You know, I was actually just thinking as an aside, obviously I'm not a director in the theater business, but what a hard job it is, because that scene, Edmund sees Edgar and says his name, but then reads a whole paragraph before he engages Edgar in conversation, which so they pulled it off, right? They pulled it off by having him appear like at the back of the room, pause, and then walk slowly towards the camera. But it would have taken me a week to figure out how to stage that. But anyway, the BBC and the Royal Shakespeare Company pulled it off quite nicely. It's playing at Stratford this summer too. Okay, so where does that leave us? You know, we've got, was Shakespeare superstitious like Gloucester? Was he a skeptic like Edmund? You can make up your own mind, but I kind of think that he's got to be on Edmund's side, because how could you, once you start making fun of Gloucester and it's so ridiculous, I mean, I kind of have to imagine that was sort of how Shakespeare saw things, or at least he was willing to embrace that view. Now, does that mean that Shakespeare was some sort of a hard-nosed, scientifically minded rationalist? Well, no, that's silly. That's taking things a little bit too far. But at the same time, I don't think Shakespeare was this. Oops, sorry, I pushed the wrong button. So I meant, when I said, was he a skeptical guy, you were supposed to be looking at this. Apologies, I was playing with the wrong computer. But at the same time, he wasn't this medieval. Caught up in this world of magic and sort of, astrology and magic, even though he was obviously aware of it because he references all of these ideas in his plays. So I don't think, I think this is the world he comes from, and I think he just has in his imagination, hints of where the world is heading, although, of course, we cannot call him a scientific figure. But I think he's in the middle, and I think the fact that he is a transitional character is part of what sort of fuels his genius and part of what makes it so interesting to read these works, and of course for many other reasons as well. So again, I couldn't have. I'm a journalist and I've been reading up, but none of this would, to write my book. Obviously, I relied on the research of many other people. Far too many to list, but these are some of the key figures whose papers and books were crucially important in all of this. And I will leave it at that. So thank you very much.
So we have time for some questions. Sylvie is the microphone runner. She's on the side there. Maybe what I'll do is I'll start off with just a quick question.
Sure.
And so you mentioned the four ghosts of Jupiter. So what was the timing of that with reference to Galileo's discovery?
Sure. Should I come to the mic? Or?
Yeah, you should.
Okay. And if you want, you can put up the one of the or is that too? There's in the bonus slides. I've got some.
Just move on. We can advance it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the timing. This is the just before Jupiter descends from the heavens. The hero is posthumous Leonatus. It's okay if you haven't seen the play, like most people haven't. Actually, just by show of hands, who has either seen or read Cymbeline? Like 3 or 4 hands have gone up. Yeah. What about Hamlet? And what about King Lear? Yeah, huge difference. Like 10 to 1. So that's interesting. Yeah, the timing. Cymbeline, of course, we don't know exactly when it was first performed, but we believe, according to the historians, summer or fall of 1610. So the timing works out perfectly. In other words, it would have been a few months after the publication of Galileo's book. And by the way, Galileo's book was a bestseller. Everybody was grabbing it up. The first edition, like people were buying it in Venice, and it was, they were all gone within a few days, and they had to print more. And copies were sent to England. We know that the English ambassador sent a copy. It's in the book, but I've forgotten the details. He sent a copy, I think, to the king, but it might have been to somebody in the court. But saying like, this is the craziest book I've seen like in ages. You've got to look at this. So everybody, I mean, not everybody, but like everybody, today when we say, well, everybody's really interested in string theory or something, we mean like some people are interested in it. But yeah, it got a lot. I mean, probably more. That wasn't a good example. I think it was more exciting than string theory. Maybe like string theory and the Higgs boson combined into one or something like that. Anyway, yeah, so I think it's quite plausible that Shakespeare heard about it, probably saw Galileo's book. Why not? He loved to read. He was reading Holinshead, he was reading Montaigne, he was reading Ovid. Why not read? He doesn't have to act, he could just flip it. He could just look at the pictures and read the information about the pictures of the moon, of the stars in the Milky Way, of the Jupiter observation. So yeah, the timing kind of works out. Like it actually is, I think, very plausible. And so that's why I'm surprised that only 3 people or a very small handful of people have actually published articles kind of investigating this.
Any other questions, comments? All right.
Good. I guess I explained everything. All right, great. But I'll be around later if anyone buys a book. I'm more than happy to sign a copy and that sort of thing. So yeah, cool.
Thank you again, Dan. I'm sure most of you noticed that, as Dan was saying, that there's a bookseller has a display in the front and selling books. So they'll be there during the break for sure. I'm not so sure they'll be after the meeting, but for sure during the break. All right. So wonderful. We've got a couple of announcements. Majid. Okay. Majid Naji is recently finished his PhD in electrical engineering, and he has a announcement about an upcoming event. I'm grateful that he's sharing with us. Let's come forward.
Thank you very much, Mike. And hi, everyone. I'm Majid. I'm from the SPIE, the International Society in Optics and Photonics student chapter at University of Ottawa. I'm here to announce our next event because we always have some events regarding optics and the photonics and, of course, astronomy. Our next event will be on the June 20 in Ottawa U. It's about the James Webb Space Telescope. So our distinguished guest will be Dr. Stahl from the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center, and he will present an informative presentation about the James Webb Space Telescope. And I'm here to announce it and also invite all of you to come as our special guest and wish to see all of you. The place will be in the Ottawa U in the site building, 800 King Edward. Wish to see all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Majid. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. A couple of announcements, then we'll go to a break. Every year, we have been every year for the last couple of years, we've been working with the Cube Gallery on their annual Nocturne event, their sort of a festival of the night. They've asked us once again to join them for their two events in July 3rd and July 10th. They're planning to have two star parties on Julian Avenue. Recall they've turned off the lights. They've worked with the city to turn off the lights on Julian Avenue. It's a great event right smack in the middle of the city. I know a number of you have participated in past years. I've thoroughly enjoyed it because the residents are really accommodating, and it's nice to see. Rob Dick, you'll notice his name's up there again, is delivering a presentation. LEDs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm sure an extension of what we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. I sent out a note to RAC members earlier about Astro Pontiac. You may remember Stefan Pape, who has talked about his now I'm forgetting the name of it, the Pontiac Astro Park that he's interested in setting up in Elmer. He's the tireless fellow that keeps driving forward to this. He's got a vision to have an outdoor venue, a planetarium as well, a place where we can set up our telescopes, and they'll be offering public stargazing, and he's keen on going forward this. He's been talking about this for a couple of years now. Now he's really moving forward. He's stepping up his awareness campaign, his fundraising efforts, and so forth. So he's asked us for our support for solar observing on June the 15th coming up. And he's got a couple of rain dates, June 16th and June 18th. Now, for those of you who are observant, you'll have noticed that one of the rain dates changed. It went from June 17th to June 18th. So a number of you have stepped forward already. Thank you. I probably could take one more volunteer. Sounds like it's going to be a pretty good event. And I really like to help Stefan because helping him will help us, I think, having this in our community, that's for sure. Next slide. I wanted to say a couple of things really quickly before we go to the break. For those of you who are here tonight and not RASC members, we do have a number of benefits in being a member of the RASC. We have a telescope library. As a member, you can sign out a number of different telescopes. We also have, you can notice in the bottom there, that's the Fred Lossing Observatory. It's an observatory that our center members can use. And we have just around the corner here, we also have a astronomy library, it's filled with astronomy books that you can sign out. Next slide. Also, with your membership, you get a number of publications, what you see on the screen here. And during the break, we'll show you another slide that we'll display that'll show many other benefits of membership. Okay, so it's break time. Please come forward, pick up your tickets for the door prizes. You can see the door prize in the front. What you do is anyhow, Sylvie will hand out the tickets, and it's available to everyone. You don't have to be a member. So, folks, we'll see you back here in what's the time right now? I see 8:53. So 9:05 we'll be back here, and we will start. Thanks.